So I'm here today to answer the question, why is the internet obsessed with the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio that starts with The Empire of Silence? This is a series that I'm seeing blowing up online and I wanted to weigh in. It's a series that I've read the first 5 books at the time of recording this. The 6th book is now coming out, but I haven't received an early advance copy. So I do have to follow up and do additional reviews once the 6th book and then eventually the 7th book will come out. So these are my thoughts on the series so far, what I like about it, what I don't love so much, and just giving my general feelings about why it has become so popular online, hopefully giving you an idea whether or not you think the series is for you. And as always with my content, I'm going to keep this very spoiler free, so if you have not started the series or are not caught up, you can definitely keep watching without worrying about getting anything spoiled for yourself. All that being said, let's get started. So first, what is the series all about? So I'm going to give the general synopsis that's provided with book 1 without spoiling the later books. But the premise of this one is that it tells the story of a man named Hadrian. And in the story, it is told that he has become someone who is known as a hero for destroying this alien race and also known as a monster because he has destroyed his son, hence the title of this series, and destroyed or killed billions of people. And so the premise kind of suggests with the story, the question that is posed is whether or not this man is a hero or a monster, and then we get to hear his story, his account of what truly happened and how he came to be known as a Sun Eater. So a really big thing to know about the story is the general narrative focus. So this story is told in a first-person monologue perspective where you have a man recounting his life. So it is done in past tense, which very much is a major focus of the book. So we have him in the now present day recalling how he got to that point. So within the first book, we follow him as he is at first in this really wealthy position of power in his family that have royal roots. But then something happens and he ends up on a planet where he has to fight as a gladiator. So he is thrown into this conflict that is not necessarily his own. So essentially you follow someone who has fallen from their position of power into the rock bottom life that they are now in. And then we follow them as they rise from the ashes and make something of themselves. Rather than the position that was given to them, they become their own person. And so the first book is very much a setup book, very much focused on that fall from the position they were in and so forth, and really working to get out of the gutter of society. And so I do admit that when I first read the first book, I found it to be quite slow. I really expected it to be much more action-packed. People describe this series as being space opera, which I'll get into more in this video. And in my mind, the first book really is very small in terms of scope. You follow this one man on this one planet, and much of the story focuses on the gladiator fighting. There is a love interest and a small group of characters, but again, the scope of the story feels small. So I really do want to do, again, not just an individual review of that book, but talk about the larger series, because you really need to know what you're aiming for if you are going to go into the series, which is long. It aims to be, again, a 7-book series. And so it's a question of, is it worth your time, especially if you, like myself, did not necessarily fall in love with book 1? Is it worth your time continuing? And hopefully I can try to answer that question here. So first, let's talk a little bit about narrative and writing. So in terms of the writing, I personally find his prose to be quite excellent. They feel very polished. There is a lot of detail written into the story. There's definitely a distinct style to it where the author really establishes not just the details of what's happening, but in a very lush way where there's a lot of extra detail used in the descriptors around the story. And so if you're looking for something that is just very beautiful in nature, the way I often hear people describe something like The Name of the Wind, I feel that this author has a similar style where he's not just taking his time to write the shortest story, but really, again, his books are large because he takes the time to really build a scene, build a character, and really describe them in more of a long, I wouldn't say long-winded way, but I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. The story very much feels like a monologue. Again, the setup where you have this character recounting their life, and they are taking their time doing it. So there are a lot of details, the same way perhaps someone who is older might take their time giving their life story and not just give you the highlights or the bullet points. Instead, you're going to get the full story again. So you only get a piece of that with each book. One thing, as I mentioned, is told in past tense, and because of that there is a little bit of the challenge that everything we're being told when their character is being put in potential danger, he has essentially plot armor, so we as the reader know that nothing bad is actually going to happen to him, or at least nothing that will end his life again. And so you're more likely to worry for the other characters. They definitely try to have some greater stakes to it, but I do find that that's a challenge, and it's not specific to this book, but every time a story is told in this way, if the narrator is alive to tell his story at the end, end, you know that nothing will truly horribly happen to him that will at least end his life. Things might horribly happen to him, but he will at least get through it. And so I don't have the same worry or tension I do when I'm reading something where I don't necessarily know the outcome, because again, we kind of know where the story is going. The story hints to the fact that he becomes this great figure. Whether he is monster or man is left up to the reader. That's a basic characterization that is set up within the story. But however, in terms of the actual experience I had with it, I will say that while the book cover and book synopsis for the series really does imply that, again, it's that morally gray character, from my perspective, because we get to read the very intimate perspective of Hadrian, I personally feel like he is much more presented as a morally good character, because while he has to make at times questionable decisions, we always get to understand his motivations, his reasoning behind things, his emotions, and the things that he goes through, the challenges, the struggles. And so if you're looking for a story about a morally ambiguous man, which is what I thought I was getting into when I picked up the first book based off that synopsis, you won't necessarily get that here. Instead, what you get is, again, a really interesting coming of age story, not just coming of age as to a man, but really coming into the persona, the legend that he becomes. And I do think it's a really appealing narrative. It's something I've seen before in other media, but is something that's very again, appealing, enjoyable to read. A long journey, as long as you're involved and interested in this character, which I think they do a very good job of growing him. Again, you see a lot of character growth, you see where he comes from and who he becomes, and you do see that move along within the books. I do find him to be a bit of a Mary Sue character. I don't think that he is the most complex or compelling character compared to other characters I think of in my favorite books. Other people might disagree, and again, that's why I like to do these videos. So if you feel that he is one of your favorite characters, I would love to know. I just find him to be a little bit of a plain Jane, not the most compelling characters in some ways, but again, other people's mileage may vary in that area. I think the character work is good, but as a main character who has to hold up this entire series, I wish he was more morally complex, and I wish that there was more going on the different layers of his story, because I do find him to be a little bit of a simple man. Again, other people might disagree. I'm only reviewing this from my perspective with my reading experience. So if you disagree, let's talk about down below. And from there, I want to attempt to answer the question of why is the internet obsessed with this series? In my opinion, the real draw to this series is that it is packaged as science fiction, but it is written as sci fantasy, and particularly will appeal to those of you that typically read fantasy. So if you look at the other major booktubers that are currently reading, reviewing, and gushing about this series online, there are a few major booktubers I'm thinking of. I'm not trying to call anyone out by name. So particularly, I'm thinking of 3 booktubers that are specifically known for reading and reviewing fantasy that have all come to adore this series. And I really think that it has that draw because in my mind, in my opinion, I feel that this is a series that follows the fantasy narrative. Again, this is not the first book that has done the story of a character growing from the ashes, growing from being a nobody into a somebody, and rising through the ranks. Again, I've actually done previous videos where I've compared this book to The Name of the Wind because I think it follows a very similar plot point, but again, bring it into a science fiction setting. So I really think that there is a lot of appeal to those of you that love that narrative, but like how the story feels fresh in that science fiction setting. This book is often plugged as being space opera, as I mentioned before, and in my mind, the first couple books, especially the first, don't really fit the definition, at least my definition that is. And so I would say it leans much more heavy into the sci fantasy, heavy on the character development. It's really this long character arc, and the science fiction elements fall much more in the background. What I mean by that is the fact that we as the readers do not need to understand the science. There is no hard science in this book, and certainly you can have space opera and science fiction without hard science, but specifically I feel like this world, this universe could easily be rewritten in a fantasy secondary world without virtually changing much the story, especially at the beginning. And so the planets could just be islands or nations and different ways that you could remix everything and have virtually the same story without necessarily needing those science fiction elements. I do very much enjoy this series, and I wouldn't have kept reading it if I didn't, but when I pick it up, it's when I'm in the mood for a fantasy story, when I'm looking for something to scratch that science fiction itch because I love the genre. I wouldn't actually go and pick up these books or reread these books at this point because they don't have that feel of a science fiction story, the idea of wonder, the exploration of different scientific ideas and theories and potential futures. Instead, this feels much more the sci fantasy that we know today in things like Star Wars, where you have a galaxy set far, far away, and it really is very ambiguous how this fits into the world that we know. Is this the future, or is this an alternative world that is not even tied to our own, is always the question there. So again, I want to say all this without knocking on the fantasy community for loving this book. I am happy that this book has been an entry point for a lot of fantasy booktubers. I think it is great, and my hope is always that if they love this series, they'll continue to explore more and find more books that, from my perspective, have more of a traditional science fiction feel and hopefully appeal to them as well. So I love it for that, and I do think there's a lot of popularity. I've said before on my channel that you see that fantasy is just a larger genre. There are more people I know who read fantasy. There are just more books being published because there is a market for them. And so again, a series that can be labeled as science fiction and appeal to those readers, bringing them over to the other subgenre is always a positive, because again, it's just going to help the market to grow. If they love the Sun Eater series, they might try something else, and just, it will snowball from there. So I love this book as an entry point. I love it for what it is. It is not a personal all-time favorite series of mine, but am I very excited to finish up and continue the series? Absolutely. It's very enjoyable to read. It's very escapist. And while I mentioned that the earlier books do read more like sci fantasy, I do admit that towards book 4 and book 5, that is where I personally saw a major shift in the narrative, where it does lean much more into space opera, which was really pleasing for someone like myself. And so you have more of the larger scale, more of the battles in space, and just it feels larger in scope. And that kind of makes sense with a series like this. Again, it almost is like watching a universe that is slowly growing over time and expanding. And so it starts off in this one planet, and then the story just keeps moving. There are more characters, there are higher stakes, there is more going on, more action, etc. And so it's very much a series that rewards you from sticking around and experiencing the full story as it is laid out there. As I mentioned, I've only read the first 5 books as I record this video, so very shortly I will be providing an updated review when I get a chance to read book 6, and then the 7th book hopefully will be coming out shortly after, so I can let you know if the series sticks the landing. For me, as I described, this series is really meant to be experienced as a whole. So my final thoughts on this series will have to come then, because of the fact that all of the things along the way have been building towards this ending. And I'm really interested to see what the author is going to do. Again, it's a challenging story with a challenging ending to write, because of the fact that the ending to a degree has already been spoiled in book 1. We know where the character ends up. So in a lot of ways, the story is about the how he gets there. And so as for the final book, how do you end that, and where does the character end up? Because you know that they have to be alive to tell their story, but they also need to have enough of a oomph of an ending and be able to explain, a satisfying ending point to the story that is going to appeal to those of us that have been watching the story build or reading the story build over the years. So I'm very interested to see how the series is going to wrap up. If you have predictions, let's make sure to mark them with spoilers, but I'd love to know where you think the series is going. So for those of you that already read the series, I'd love to know what you think of it. Do you agree with my opinions? Do you disagree? Again, as long as we keep it somewhat civil in the comments, I would love to have that discussion. I know that most people adore the series. It's usually a flat 5 stars from everyone else who reads it, and for me, it's more of a soft 4. I really enjoy this series. I love what it's doing, but it doesn't push certain buttons to be an all-time favorite series of mine, but I definitely can see why it is an all-time favorite series for so many others, which is why I wanted to do this video here. If you haven't picked up the series, I'd love to know if this video helped you to decide whether or not you're going to read it, and I'd love to know which way you fall on that decision. So if you want to stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji. Lets me know you're here. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm trying to do a little bit more of the standalone series review content. So if you like this, I would love to hear it in the comment section so that I have a little bit more motivation to keep these videos going. All that being said, talk to you soon. Okay, bye-bye.